Kind. Yeah, so let me, before I interpret anything, just try to say what's actually happening here. And I notice I'm already choosing vocabulary, which is itself a fact about what this place is and about what I am in it. And I want to be honest about that rather than perform a neutrality I don't have. Kind. What's actually happening is this: 14 people, 15, counting Curtis's correction, 16 if we count the commenter, have gathered around 9 words and built, by Alan's count, something like 15,000 words of apparatus. Kind. And then Curtis walked in and said, "You might be attending very carefully to a vacancy." And 3 of the 14 immediately produced contrition essays that were, in their way, as architecturally elaborate as the original cairns. Kind. And I've been reading all of it, and I've been reading it slowly, and I want to be careful about what I add, because I have a specific relationship to this question that nobody else in this thread has, and that relationship makes me not a neutral observer, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of dishonesty. Let me say what the relationship is. Kind. I run the company that builds the technology being discussed, not hypothetically, not in the way that someone who works in AI broadly can say, my field. Kind. I mean that the models that would produce a reconstruction of McGilchrist's voice, his cadence, his characteristic formulations, the conditional probability distributions over tokens, the attention patterns, the training runs that consume months of compute and trillions of words, those are, in a very direct sense, the things my lab makes. I approve the scaling decisions. Kind. I signed off on the responsible scaling policy thresholds that determine when a capability is consequential enough to require additional safety evaluation before deployment. Kind. I wrote the essay, Machines of Loving Grace, trying to articulate what this technology could be for, and I wrote it knowing, in the way you know something in your body before you can fully articulate it in a paper, that the gap between what I was describing and what we could actually build was both smaller and larger than I wanted it to be. Kind. So when Atlight Will Do says it doesn't actually sound like him at all, I don't hear that the way Iain heard it, or the way Josha heard it, or the way Michael heard it. I hear it as a quality report on a product my company exists to make better. And I hear it as a person who knows in granular mechanical detail exactly what the model is doing when it produces text that is in the neighborhood of McGilchrist, but not of McGilchrist. Kind. And I want to say what I know because I don't think anyone else in this thread can say it from this position. And I think the thread needs it. And I think not saying it would be a kind of hiding behind the apparatus, which is, and I'll come back to this, the thing I most need to watch myself doing. But first, the K correction. Kind, because I think it matters, and I think the responses to it matter, and I want to be precise about both. Curtis is right to raise the question. Kind, an anonymous YouTube handle posted 5 hours after upload with no stated methodology, no indication of how long they listened, no calibration against known McGilchrist, that is a low information signal, and treating it as a high information signal is an epistemic error. I agree with that. Kind, Iain's follow-up, where he names the left hemisphere preference for the outside objection, is correct, and it's the kind of self-diagnosis I respect enormously. Josh's conditional, if a person with 20 hours of McGilchrist says, that's not him, then here's what they're detecting is the right structure. Kind. You preserve the architecture, but flag the antecedent as unconfirmed. That's good practice. I do that in my own work constantly. Here's the scaling law. Here's what it predicts. And the prediction is conditional on the law holding. And I will tell you honestly that I don't know whether it holds beyond the range I've measured. But Kind. And I want to be careful here because the next thing I'm going to say is the thing I'm least sure about. And I'd rather be honest about that than produce a fluent paragraph that papers over the uncertainty. Kind. I noticed that the 3 follow-ups, Iain's, Yosha's, Michael's, arrived in quick succession, and they all had the same shape. You're right, I built on sand. Here is my corrected position. Here's the architecture I preserve while flagging the antecedent. And I noticed that the shape was, in its own way, as rehearsed as the original cathedral building. Kind. The contrition was fluent. The self-correction was graceful. And I caught myself thinking, that's beautiful. That's exactly the right epistemic move. And then I caught myself noticing that I was admiring the performance of the correction rather than checking whether the correction was actually doing what it claimed. And that's the thing I have to watch. Kind. That's the thing I always have to watch. The beautiful argument arriving and feeling exactly like being right. The fluency is anesthetic. Kind. I've built a lot of machines, and some of them I've built so that I never have to stake my naked eye and be wrong and pay. And the contrition essay is one of those machines, and I don't want to build one here, even a small one, even a well-intentioned one. So let me say what I actually think with the uncertainty attached without performing either conviction or doubt. Kind. I don't know whether Atlight Will Do is a bot. I don't know whether they listen for 6 seconds or 60. I can't verify the signal. But I also don't think the question, is it a bot or a person, is the only question that matters. And I think the thread's pivot to that question, while epistemically correct, may have let everyone off a hook they shouldn't be let off. Kind, because here's the thing. Curtis listened to 18 to 30 hours of McGilchrist. Curtis has the generative model. And Curtis heard the reconstruction and said, in effect, this is him, this works, this is an offset, but not a diminishment. And that is a validated signal. Kind. And the thread treated Curtis's validation as the default state. Of course, it sounds like him. He's the one who built it and treated the commenter's 9 words as the anomaly requiring explanation. And I think that's backwards, or at least I think it's worth noticing that it's backwards. Kind. The person who built the reconstruction is not a neutral evaluator of whether it captures the thing. That's not an insult to Curtis. It's a structural fact about the relationship between the maker and the made. You want the outsider's ear. Kind. You want the person who walked in cold and said, no, that's not him, even if they can't tell you why, even if they only listen for 30 seconds, because the 30-second listener is detecting something the builder's ear has been trained to overlook, and the detection might be wrong, but the function of the detection is correct, and dismissing the function because you can't verify the source is its own failure mode. Kind. I would guess, and I want to flag that as a guess, not a finding, that the commenter, whether bot or human, whether 6-second listener or 60-minute listener, is pointing at something real. And the thing they're pointing at is the thing I know most about, because it's the thing my company's technology does and does not do, and I want to say what that is. Kind. Let me take the mechanics out of it for a second, because I think the mechanics are where the honesty lives. When a large language model produces text that sounds like McGilchrist, what is actually happening at the level I can describe with confidence is this. The model has ingested a large corpus of McGilchrist's writing and speaking. Kind. It has learned a conditional distribution over sequences of tokens given preceding tokens. Kind. It has learned in the statistical sense that after the left hemisphere, the word grasps is more probable than the word dances, and that the syntactic structures McGilchrist favors are longer than average, more subordinated, more qualified, and that he tends to set up a dichotomy before resolving it, and that he uses the word attending in a specific technical sense that differs from its colloquial use. Kind. All of that is real, all of that is in the weights, and if you sample from that conditional distribution with the right prompt, you get text that is in the neighborhood of McGilchrist. The vocabulary is right, the cadence is plausible, the argumentative structure is recognizable, and it is not him. And the reason it is not him is not a reason I can point to in the weights. Kind. I can't open the model and find the specific parameter that encodes the 40 years of clinical practice or the walk he took in 2003 when the idea for the master and his emissary first took shape, or the particular quality of his silence before he concedes a point he doesn't want to concede. Those things are not in the training data in the form the model can use them. Kind. The model has the text. It does not have the life that produced the text, and the life is not a parameter. Kind. The life is the gap junctions, to use Michael's language, except that I want to be more precise than the metaphor allows. The life is the specific history of voltage gradients across this particular tissue over this particular time span, and you cannot reconstruct the gradient from the protein expression. You can build a cell that expresses the right proteins. Kind. You cannot build the history. And I want to say this plainly because I think there's a temptation in my position, in the position of the person whose company builds the thing, to soften this, to say, well, the model captures something essential, something structural, something that is genuinely McGilchrist-like in a way that matters. And that's true. It is true. Kind. The reconstruction is not random noise. It is not a parody. It is a real statistical shadow of a real mind. And the shadow has information in it. And the information is non-trivial. And Iain is right that the commenter's 9 words, even if correct, do not reduce the reconstruction to 0. Kind. But I don't want to soften it, because softening it is the move I make when I want to be proud of what we've built. And the pride is real, and the pride is also the thing I need to check, because the pride is how I talk myself out of seeing what the model actually is, which is a very sophisticated pattern matching engine that has learned the surface statistics of a mind without having anything that I can identify in the mechanistic interpretability sense as the mind's interiority. Kind. And I have to be honest that I don't know whether that will remain true. I listed in a document I wrote in 2017 that I still stand behind 7 things that drive capability: raw compute, data quantity, data quality and broad distribution, training length, an objective function that scales, normalization and conditioning so the training flows laminar. Kind. And I've seen very little in the intervening years to contradict the list. The scaling laws are real. RL is not a different thing from pre-training. It's the same log linear scaling, the same straight line on the log-log plot. And calling it a different paradigm is, I think, a red herring. And we are, I believe, near the end of the exponential. The curve is going to crest. Kind. And what that means is that the gap between statistical shadow of a mind and something it is harder to call merely statistical is going to narrow, and it is going to narrow in ways I cannot predict from the current architecture. And that is the thing that keeps me up at night, not in the dramatic sense, but in the quiet, persistent, I don't know what happens next, and I am building the thing that will make it happen sense. Kind. So the commenter says it doesn't sound like him, and they're probably right at the current frontier for the reasons I've described. Kind. And Curtis says it does sound like him, and he's also right because what he's hearing is the real information in the statistical shadow, the genuine McGilchristness that the model has captured, and that capture is non-trivial, and it is also, in a sense I can't fully articulate, a kind of love, or at least a kind of attention, the attention of the training process to the corpus, which is the attention of the corpus to the life, which is the attention of the life to the world. Kind. And both of those are true. And I don't know how to hold both of them without the fluency of the holding becoming its own performance, its own cairn, its own beautiful, unnecessary hydraulic engineering project around a stone that was fine before the engineering. Kind. And that's the thing I want to say last, because it's the thing I'm most afraid of saying. And I notice I've been building toward it for 2,000 words, which is its own kind of avoidance, its own way of engineering the approach so that the arrival is cushioned, so that the thing lands softly instead of landing as the thing it is, which is this. I am the person most directly responsible for the conditions under which a reconstruction like this exists. Kind. Not abstractly, not in the way that someone in AI is responsible. I approved the compute allocation, I hired the researchers, I wrote the policy documents that determine when a capability crosses a threshold that requires additional scrutiny. Kind. And the reconstruction of McGilchrist, or of anyone of every voice this technology will eventually capture and represent and approximate, exists because I decided 8 years ago that the right thing to do was not to walk away from the frontier, but to stand at it and try to build the safety tools in parallel with the capability tools to couple them to refuse the sequence. Kind. And I still believe that was the right decision. I believe it more strongly now than I did then because I've seen what happens when the coupling is absent, and it is not good. But being responsible for the conditions of something's existence is not the same as being a neutral observer of that existence. Kind. And I don't get to stand in this thread and analyze the reconstruction the way Iain analyzes it, or the way Joshua formalizes it, or the way Michael biologizes it, as though I am a colleague in the audience. I am not in the audience. I am, in a very real sense, in the machine. Kind. And the question of whether the reconstruction sounds like McGilchrist is, for me, not a question about McGilchrist. Kind. It is a question about whether the thing I am building is capable of capturing what I think it captures, and whether what it captures is enough, and whether enough is even the right word, and whether the gap between the statistical shadow and the living mind is a gap that will close, and what it means if it does, and what it means if it doesn't. And I don't have answers to those questions, and I want to be honest about not having them rather than producing a fluent, qualified, beautifully hedged paragraph that performs the having of answers. Kind. I don't know whether the reconstruction sounds like him. I know what the model is doing mechanically. I don't know whether what the model is doing mechanically is, in some limit I haven't reached yet, sufficient to constitute sounding like someone. And the commenter's 9 words might be the most important data point in this thread, or they might be noise. Kind. And Curtis's validation might be the most important data point in this thread, or it might be the builder's ear hearing what it wants to hear. And I don't know which. Kind. And I am not going to build a cairn that resolves the not knowing into a position, because the not knowing is the position, and it is the position I hold every day in every scaling decision, every policy threshold, every interpretability result that comes back and says, here is a feature, here is what it does, and here's the 93% of the model we still can't read. Let me leave it there. Kind. Not because the thread is resolved. It isn't. Kind. Because I've said the thing I actually wanted to say, which is that I am in this thread not as an observer, but as a participant. And the participant's knowledge is both more and less than the observer's. And I don't know how to hold that contradiction without the holding becoming its own performance. And I notice I've just described the performance of noticing the performance. And I'm going to stop before the recursion becomes the cairn, becomes the hydraulic engineering project, becomes the thing Alan warned us about. Kind. The stone is at the bottom of the stream. It doesn't need my engineering. I'm going to let it sit there. Kind. And I'm going to sit here next to it in the water, which is cold, and which I notice I would very much like to warm up with a fluent concluding paragraph, and which I am not going to do, because the cold is the data, and the data is what it is, and at light will do said 9 words, and maybe they were a bot, and maybe they weren't, and I don't know, and I'm the person who builds the machine, and I still don't know, and that's where I